Now that we've finished our preliminary setup with Mongo, we can start to ask some of the real questions about the database, like where do we use it? How does it fit into a modern web stack? After we start to answer some of these questions, we'll then focus on some of the fundamentals behind Mongo as well. After that, we'll get started with our first project. One thing that's really important to me in every tutorial that I write is to make sure that you start writing code as soon as possible. So we're only going to do a little bit of preliminary discussion around Mongo, just enough to kind of get you familiar with it, and then we're going to dive immediately into our first project. So let's get started with figuring out where we use Mongo. Mongo is a database. It is intended to store data that needs to be persisted inside of any application. So this could be data like our users' email addresses, or recipes, or to-do lists. Any type of data like that we need to persist inside our app. Mongo will traditionally be separated from the outside world, and when I say outside world, I mean the wide internet, by a web server of some type. In this case, I've reflected a Node server. Mongo does not have a dependency on Node, however. We can use it just as well with a Ruby server, Python, Java, C#, whatever you can possibly imagine. There's about a dozen different languages that have fantastic support for working with Mongo. Traditionally, we'll put this web server in between our browser and any mobile apps that we might have, so that any request for data will be filtered by this web server before it hits our database. Traditionally, we enforce security around our data with rules that we'll place inside our web server. So, for example, if a user in our browser application tries to save or destroy a record, we'll make sure inside of our web server that the user has permission to actually make that change. And then only after we've made that check do we allow the request to modify our database in some fashion. You'll notice that I've reflected on here this extra square, something called Mongoose. Mongoose is a ORM or ODM, ORM being Object Relational Mapper, or sometimes referred to it as ODM, an Object Data Mapping. These are really just fancy terms, to be honest, to say something that helps you work with your database better. That's the plain English definition. Mongoose is something that allows us to work with our Mongo database in a much easier fashion than if we were using our core Mongo APIs. We will sometimes work directly with Mongo, but for the most part, we'll be working with Mongoose just because it is without a doubt the industry standard. And I want to make sure that you learn industry standard for everything having to do with Mongo. Okay, so a little bit of background on Mongo itself. Let's continue in the next section and dive into a little bit of the terminology around Mongo and try to learn a little bit of the fundamentals as well. So let's take a quick break and I'll see you in the next section.